Great. So for this session in our racial justice series, we are very proud and pleased to present Ike Leggett, who is a former county council, former county council member as well as county executive. He has a fascinating career with stints in the military, stints teaching at Howard University, and he is quite an interesting person. And if you've never met him in person, I can tell you that he's very friendly, very warm person, and he makes for a good presentation. So with that, Mr. Leggett, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much, Doug, and I hope you can hear me. I hope the sound comes through fairly well. I'm talking through some earphones here, and it's a little bit challenging at times for me to understand and relate to the volume and such. I also apologize for the background. My wife has taken a better positions downstairs where we normally do these things. She tends to get up earlier than I do, and therefore she gets the best position, so I apologize for that. Let me also thank all of you for tuning in today, and thank you for having the privilege to serve for a number of years as your county executive and at-large member of the county council. I'm delighted with the time that I had a chance to serve. I hope that I served you well. I really appreciate the opportunity to serve you in the capacity of leadership that I've had throughout my tenure in Montgomery County in public office. Let me also acknowledge a number of you here. You may know that I am from Louisiana, and I come to you by two connections, one through Doug formally, and also through the urging of Norma Wilson, who happens to be from Louisiana. But when she indicated that I should participate on this, she made a promise to make certain that I would be here, that she promised me that I would get a good pot of Louisiana gumbo. And so I am looking for that gumbo, and I hope that all of you will remind her of what she promised. And being a good, solid Montgomery County resident, you don't want her to renege on her pledge. So I look forward to that gumbo. I really love gumbo. And the woman has promised me to get the gumbo. So.
Oh no!
Well, let me start for a couple of moments to give you a little bit of a background, because far too often people are not quite as familiar with my background. Many of you have known me in my role as a county executive, as a member of the county council. Often people refer to me in some ways as Professor Dean Leggett, because for many years I served as a law professor at Howard University Law School, and was also the assistant dean and the associate dean of the law school. And other people know me through my military background. And some people know me from my prior role as serving as the head of the Montgomery County Human Rights Commission as well. I served in one stint as the chairman of the Maryland Democratic Party. So I've had a number of jobs, community service over the years, but when people look at it, most often they are looking at the public service sector of my life. And for some reason, people assume that I've been in Montgomery County for all of my life, that I was born and raised in Montgomery County because of my many years in public service. Well, for those of you who really know me, I'm not an original Montgomery County resident. I'm originally from Louisiana, as I stated a few moments ago. But it's been an interesting transition in my life. And I would say that my life is a remarkable story. And it comes at the transition of what we see today in our society in terms of race, accomplishments, the challenges we face as a nation, what we face here locally as a community. Oftentimes, I don't talk too much about this. Seldom have I talked openly about race. Seldom have I gone into as much detail as I've gone in the last several months. And it came about for this particular reason. Several months ago, right before the pandemic, my granddaughter asked me would I come to speak to her African-American history class. And I thought about it for a moment, and naturally as a grandfather, proud grandfather, I told her yes. And I came to the class, And you have to see this through the eyes of fifth graders. Because oftentimes when you're speaking, you're talking to people who are your age or people who understand a great deal about race, understand a great deal about the challenges that this nation has gone through over so many years and the struggles that we continue to have today. But when you see it through the eyes of a fifth grader, things are somewhat different. And so when I talk to them about growing up in Louisiana, going to a segregated school, drinking out of separate water fountains, sitting in the balcony of a movie theater, or riding on the back of the bus, I noticed something that was quite amazing to me. As I described those kinds of things about my actual life, their eyes were just aglow with interest because they certainly had heard about these things before, but they'd heard about those things in a history book. They've heard those things from someone describing what happened to other people, but seldom had they heard them from someone who in fact was engaged and involved in those kinds of things. And that interest and the feelings that they expressed at that class was just simply amazing to me. We take it for granted that we all understand the history of the civil rights struggle. But we take it for granted that our young people, because they've read, they've seen, and they've witnessed certain things by way of a textbook, what you see it writing, that they fully understand and comprehend all of what we've talked about. But to hear someone describe it, someone they can ask questions to and address questions to and so forth, is a far different attitude and feeling. And when I talk to them about my struggles in the civil rights movement, when I met people like Dr. King, and I had an opportunity to talk to them, it was just as though a light bulb had gone off in their minds and their eyes and so forth. And so what I left with is that I had failed in a certain area of responsibility by not sharing as comprehensive as I should, as broadly as I should, my early life struggles and the challenges that I faced growing up as a young African American in Louisiana and growing up in the height of segregation and Jim Crow, experienced some of the things that I've experienced in life. And now to be, had been for 12 years, the county executive of one of the largest counties in America, one of the most wealthy, one of the most diverse. So you go from living in abject poverty, one of 13 kids in a 3-room house in Louisiana. And I did not describe 3 bedrooms or 3 bathrooms, 3 rooms, period. No indoor plumbing and no electricity. That's the struggle. And you come from that to positions of leadership that I've experienced here in Montgomery County is a remarkable story. It is a remarkable story, not only about me, but it's a remarkable story about America, about this country, and certainly about Montgomery County. Let me just give you an example of a couple of things before I go to questions and answers. I said before, I grew up in Louisiana, a small town called Alexandria, Louisiana. One of 13 kids, abject poverty. When I was in school, undergraduate school, grade school, I was not deemed to be a successful person. If you ask people in my community today, that community today, they would have a different description of me as a young person. A couple of years ago, I attended the funeral of one of my sisters who continued to live in Alexandria, Louisiana. And at the funeral, at the church that my family originally attended, which is still there, one of the ministers, or the son of the minister of the church that was a minister for our community for so many years, who now lives in a different city in Baton Rouge, came back to Alexandria to speak at the funeral. And because he knew most of the family, and the new minister did not know the family quite as well. And so they gave him an opportunity to speak because he knew my sister very well. And so he looks out at the congregation at the funeral, and he sees me sitting there, and he said, I'm not sure everybody around me realized that Ike Leggett was not deemed to be successful. Many of you know him as a military officer, served in Vietnam, account executive, a law professor, all the accolades, all the awards he received. But he said when he grew up, we grew up together. This kid was one of the worst kids in the community. This kid got me a whipping virtually every day because I followed his lead and he was so bad. This kid growing up in this community, and look around this community today, look at what you see. Even now, this community is in a deteriorating position. How is it that this kid could grow up to be as successful as he is? He said most people did not give him an opportunity, would not realize that this kid would be successful. He said, I realized many years ago that he would be successful. He said, let me explain to you why. He said, many of you may recall that his arm was broken when he was about 10 years of age. No one really knows how that arm was broken except for me. And I refuse to tell anyone how he broke his arm up until today. And I'm going to now tell you how he broke his arm. He said, this is what happened. He said, this bad kid, Ike Leggett, the county executive of Montgomery County, the military officer, all of those beautiful things you hear about him and so forth. He talked me into stealing plums from a lady in our community. First, he went over with me to ask the lady, can we gather some plums for our tree? And she said no. So as we were walking away, Spud, as they called me, turned to me and said, she's going to pay for that. She should have given us some plums. And so what happened later on that night, he came to my house across the street. He said, we're going to go over and raid that plum tree. He said, we shouldn't do that. He said, I told him we should. He said, no, we're going to go to the plum tree tonight. And so we go to the plum tree. We're in the tree. We're gathering plums. We have our bags in the backyard of this lady's house. And all of a sudden, in the excitement of gathering the plums, Spud, Ike Leggett, falls out of the tree. He falls out of the tree and breaks his arm. He doesn't yell. He doesn't scream. He doesn't say anything. He picks up his bag. We leave. We go back home. He spends the night at home. The following morning, he goes to school with me. And at the first recess, we go outside to play. And all of a sudden, Spud purposely falls to the ground, grabs his arm and said, oh my God, I broke my arm. And we rushed him to the hospital. He said, now, what I learned from that was this kid at 10 years of age maintained a broken arm overnight, didn't say anything, didn't yell, didn't scream, figured out that he needed an excuse to inform people how he broke his arm. And he goes to school the following day, falls on the ground, grabs his arm and says, I've just broken my arm. And they rush him to the hospital. He said, if this kid could do that at 10 years of age, I am not surprised that he's a county executive. I'm not surprised that he was a military officer. I'm not surprised of any other things that have happened because he's very disciplined, he's very smart, and he knows how to get things done. But he said no one would have realized that coming out of poverty in Louisiana as we've experienced it. When I came to college, when I attended college, I was not deemed to be a successful student. I was not intending to go to college. I decided that maybe I should join the military. But my mother and my high school football coach suggested to me, why don't you try a program at Southern University? And at Southern University, they had this program where you worked during the summer prior to your first year of college. And as you worked, you lived in a dormitory and they applied the monies that you earned toward room and board. I got on a bus and traveled to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The farthest that I'd ever been was about 100 miles from Alexandria. Walked up to the business office and said, you know, I would love to participate in this program. And they said, well, where's your letter of authorization? I didn't have one. They said, no. I came back an hour later. They said, well, where's your transcript? Where's this? I had nothing. They told me no a second time. I came back a third time. I came back a fourth time. And they told me no 4 separate times. And as I was walking away, the lady called me back and said, listen, we've told you no 4 times. For some reason, you won't simply go away. But she said, I'll make a promise with you. If you're willing to work with the outside maintenance crew, I would ask the Dean of Student Affairs whether or not you can stay in the student dormitory. and we can maybe put something together for you. But you're not in the official program. If you're willing to work with them, we can sort of hobble something together for you. Now, what that meant, work with the outside maintenance crew, was picking up the trash and the garbage and cutting the grass around the university campus. That's what I did. That's what I did as a young person in order to attend college. But I still did not have enough money to enter the first year. But my church, back home in Alexandria, Louisiana, they were having, throughout the summer, raising monies for a scholarship fund. And they raised monies all summer. They did what we do in the South. They had these chicken fries and fish sandwiches that they sold. They did all of those kinds of things through the entire summer. At the end of the summer, they had raised a grand total of $37, which had to be divided among 3 students. We got just over $12 apiece. That's just how poor we were. Still undaunted by that. The first year I did get into school, but still not enough to make it all the way through. I realized that the senator that represented our area by the name of Isiah Blair was someone that my family had worked for. And so I go down to the state office, and after trying for several times at the state General Assembly to talk to him, he comes outside and I give an opportunity to talk to him. And as you know, in many states, these senators and legislators have what is called a scholarship fund. And they give funds or give monies to grants to the various students in and around their community. And I asked him for a scholarship. He looked at me incredulous, like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, I don't think that I've given much of any scholarship to anyone at that school, which is a historical African-American college, Southern University. And so I left dejected. But 3 weeks later, I received a call from the business office and someone said to me, come over, they want to talk to you. I go to the business office and they said, Senator Blair has given you a scholarship. I don't think we've gotten many scholarships from him. How did you get that? I said, I just asked him. He gave me a scholarship. Now, why do I mention these 2 scholarships or these 2 opportunities? The money is given to me by this little small church, the $12. That was given to me out of love, out of a respect for me and for my family. It was only $12. It was all that they could give, with the expectation, the love, and the prayers of helping me make something productive in my life. The scholarship now from Senator Blair was given to me almost like a backhand slap. Like, get this kid out of my way. I don't think he's going to matter to anything. Make a good impression in life. Give him the scholarship and let's be done with it. And so I've been motivated in many parts of my life by these 2 scholarships. One given out of love by the people who wanted to make sure that I could be successful and believing in me through their prayers, that motivated me to not let them down. The second was to demonstrate to Senator Blair that I, along with any and all other African-American kids, were worthy of scholarships and worthy of the support, and that he should invest in us. And so I was moved by those 2 things, one out of love and one out of spite, that propelled me to garner the energy, the motivation to do as much as I could to be successful. And with that, I went on to be a community leader, a college student body president, engaged in a number of activities, meeting all the great civil rights people in the struggle, staying in the military as an ROTC graduate, and I ended up with 4 degrees and all the other things that you know about in my life. But it was those 2 scholarships, growing up in the height of segregation and Jim Crow, that have propelled me so far. But that doesn't end the story, because what happened is that I ended up ultimately in Montgomery County, attended college, law school at Howard University, and got involved as the chair of the Montgomery County Human Rights Commission right after I came out of law school, teaching law school. And I've worked in Montgomery County and I know this community very well. We have done better, we've improved, but there are challenges and difficulties that we have gone through, and I've gone through personally. Many of you don't know about those because I would not talk about them. My task was to get the job done, not to dwell about race, not to get involved in so many of the other struggles, and to demonstrate to people that I could not professionally do what is asked of me without getting into a prolonged discussion about race. Mistakenly, I didn't think the county could accept that sort of deep, detailed discussion and would distract from other things that I wanted to achieve for Montgomery County, even though I wanted to make certain that we address the racial challenges within Montgomery County. When I ran for public office the first time for county council at large, this was 1986. We had not elected at that point in time, 86 now, which is not too long ago, any person of color to any political position in Montgomery County, not to the county council, anywhere in the General Assembly, to the courthouse, county executive, nothing, zero. So I was the first person elected to a purely political position in Montgomery County in 1986. But here's something that was interesting. Because we were so fearful of the challenges of race, for 6 months, there was no photograph of Ike Leggett on my campaign literature. 6 months, no photograph of me. Why? Because my astute campaign manager and others said, you know what? We want people to get to know you. We want them to read about your background. We want them to read about the issues that you're advocating for. We want them to understand fully who you are. But oftentimes what happened when they see just the photograph, they would reject it and not go very far with that. So that's what we did. So I was running Ike Leggett for county council at large for 6 months, and no one knew who I was in terms of photograph. But after we got people indoctrinated to that idea, I ultimately ended up winning for an at-large position as a county council member. At least I'd won the primary. And so now I was feeling very good. My photograph is on all the literature. And I'm in Friendship Heights in Montgomery County, right at Western Avenue, just after the primary. And I'm passing out literature to people walking along the sidewalk. There was an elderly white gentleman coming out of one of the high-rise buildings in Friendship Heights, right there at Western Avenue. And I gave him my literature with me now, the Democratic nominee for county council. He looks at it, looks at me, looks again at the literature. He hands it back to me. And you know what he says? He said, young man, I'm sorry, but I do not vote in the District of Columbia. What he assumed was that I was on the wrong side of Western Avenue, that I was really a candidate in the District of Columbia, and I could not in any shape or form be a candidate running for county council in Montgomery County. That happened to me in '85. So I've gone through these challenges, running for office in most part of my life, and stories that could go on forever. But here's one that happened most recently, two. One of which is when I was running for the last time now, in 2014, for the last time for county executive. I have this routine of driving to certain polls the night before the election, and I want to put the signs up at 17 different polls. And I have this route that I go because the first time I ran for office, this is what I did. You know, essentially every election after that, I followed that routine. Even though we now had many volunteers to go out and do essentially what I wanted to do. My desire was to put those signs at those locations. Maybe it's superstition, I'm not sure. But it worked the first time, and therefore I'm going to do it every time until I lose an election. And so I tell my people working and volunteers, I will take care of these polls. I will put the signs up myself. So the night before the election, I would drive around to these certain locations and put those signs up. So I'm driving around, putting the signs up, and I get to the very last one, which is at Good Hope Road, the Good Hope Community Center. And just as I'm driving up to the center, I hear the sirens behind me. I look to see that it's a public safety car, police. I said, oh my goodness, maybe I was driving too fast coming down Good Hope Road. And so I get out And this officer, a white gentleman, happened to be about 6'6", extremely large. He starts to yell at me. And he says to me, "Why are you here?" He starts to curse. And I'm looking at him in bewilderment. I just literally cannot believe that this is happening. And I'm dressed now, blue jeans, a sweater, a baseball cap. At the same time, a little bit later, a woman gets out on the other side of the car, the female officer. She's a little bit older. And she looks at the scene in front of her. This police yelling and screaming at me, cursing at me. And as she started walking toward us, I could see this expression on her face. It's like, "Oh, is that the county executive?" No, I'm not quite sure. That just cannot be the county executive. And as she's walking and getting closer and closer, you could see the expression on her face like, "Oh my God, this must be him. Oh, I can't be him. I can't believe we've done this. Maybe it's not him. But yeah, I think it is him. Oh my God, we've jacked up the county executive out here on Good Hope Road. How in the world we've done this?" And so she gets closer to us. You know, the first thing that comes out of my mouth was, "Oh, Mr. Leggett, I didn't know this was you." Now, why should that have mattered? Why should that have mattered? She said, "Besides, this officer," and she's pointing to the other officer, "he didn't know that was you. He's from Howard County." So she threw him under the bus. Threw him under the bus. Now, the problem with that, what if that had been a young volunteer, 14 or 15 years of age, who may have panicked in that situation, and you had an altercation out there about putting up a sign at a polling station? That's just how tough that is. When I left there, I was torn between two thoughts. One was how incredibly irresponsible that was of that officer and the things that could have gone wrong in that situation. And the other was, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. She's throwing the guy under the bus and screaming that he's from Howard County. And I was torn between laughter and almost being in tears. That's Montgomery County. I'm the current county executive. I have a popularity level of up 80% almost. Just about everybody in the county knows me. I'd already served 4 terms as council member, 2 terms as county executive, now running for the 3rd term as county executive. And this happened to the African-American county executive in his own county. And finally, just something that happened a couple of months ago. During the height of the pandemic, when everything was shut down, it was difficult, long lines, going to the stores and so forth. I go to my Giant that's near my house, and there are long lines to go through and get checked out and those kinds of things. So I go through the line, and I had picked up a package of corn. And I thought I had bought, and I called this situation the white corn versus the yellow corn. I picked up what I thought was white corn. That's what I wanted. But when I got to the cash register, it turned out to be a package of yellow corn. Now, the price were the same. So I said to myself, I do not want to go all the way back through this entire line with about 10 people in line to get the right corn. So I said to the lady, I said, you know, at the price of the same, I should be able to just go over there and pick up the white corn. She said, that's right. She said, I said, I'll tell you what you do. You just take this over. When you checked out, I'll put the price in. And when you go out the door, over by the door, you just exchange the yellow corn for the white corn. I said, okay, that's fair. Because I was not about to go back through that line, spend a half an hour to switch the corn from the yellow corn to the white corn. All right? So I walked toward the door, and as I'm walking, I said, how is this going to look? Me just going over and picking up, as a black man, corn out of the thing and walking out the door. They've got cameras all over this store. somebody's going to assume that this black man is still in corn. So you know what I do? I pick the yellow corn out of the bag and I hold it up in the air so that they can see on the cameras that I've got a package of corn. So when I go to the bin, I hold up the corn that I've already brought over. I carefully put it down, right? And then I pick up the white corn and I hold it up so if the cameras can see it, they can see I got another package of corn. I switch one for the other. And then I walked out the door. How crazy is that? Here I am, a former county executive, having to go through these gyrations of demonstrating for the cameras potentially in the giant that I'm not stealing white corn. That may sound silly, but I want you to think about that because that is what African Americans, what we go through each and every day. The humiliation, the pain, the suffering, the difficulties, the struggles. For even me, a person who has 4 degrees, who would have and on the assumption of every success that you can name, I went through all of that and more. This is why I forwarded to you a couple of things for you to read. One of which was a transcript of Pete Carroll talking to his football team. Although he's talking to the team, what he's saying basically is this. I hope you go back and look at it. It's only about 14 minutes. What he's saying is essentially this, is that African Americans alone cannot solve this problem. We can scream about Black Lives Matters, we could demonstrate, we can do all of those things, but there's only so far that we could go. It requires for us as a nation to be successful, but we not have white silence. We can't have the noise and the demonstration where there's white silence on the sideline. You have to engage. You have to recognize that this is a problem. The fact that we are still dealing with this today, some 50 years or so from the civil rights struggle, we're still dealing with much of this today, is a sad commentary, not for me, but for my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who would follow. So I want you to look at that carefully. Understand that this is not something to be played with. This is not something that will bring us together and have this nation fulfill the promise of our nation until we've successfully dealt with this. It will require all of us to work. And when we're working in a time when there's so much division, there's so many struggles, we're dealing with economic challenges, we're dealing with a health crisis, and we're dealing with racial division within our country. But I am convinced, because I'm a very optimistic person, that we have the capacity to resolve this. Remember I told you about the challenges that we started off with me fearful to put my photograph on the literature? This county elected an African American 7 times. I want you to think about this now. They voted for me at large 7 times for various offices in Montgomery County, with an African American population that started off with only 6%. When I ran in my last race, it was never got no more than about 12 or 13%, and overwhelmingly elected me to every one of those positions. That says not as much about me per se, but it says so much about the goodness of this county, so much about what we have in common, so much about what we can do as a great nation. So think about what I am saying. Despite the struggles, despite the challenges, this still, in my opinion, is the best nation on this earth. I have traveled. Remember I told you before, for the first time in college, up until that point, I had never been beyond maybe 100 miles from my home. I've now traveled around the world probably 10 or 11 times. And I can tell you, there's no greater place on this earth than America. Despite our flaws, despite our problems, despite the racism, and it is systemic, despite all the challenges we have, this is still the greatest nation on earth. And if it could happen to me, coming out of a segregated Louisiana, struggling as I struggle, in abject poverty, to go to the height of leadership that I have been in and continue to serve in, this is a nation with enormous promise and enormous opportunity. But for us to make sure that we get that last hurdle beyond us, it's going to require a great deal of effort. It is though we've taken a football on a football field, and we've moved that football field from our own end zone down to the 20-yard line or 15-yard line of the opposition. We have only 15 yards to go. We've now traveled 85 yards. But the last 15 yards is a difficult 15 yards to get through because you have narrow places to run and pass. You have fewer options to make mistakes.
No,
And the defense is really, really prepared for you.
Oh,
So we have to fight through that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ike. We're awfully glad that you left the people of Louisiana behind and came here instead. I will open it up to anyone who has questions at this point.
well, I'm Yvonne Irvin. I'd like to say, County Executive Leggett, that I am here at the invitation of Norma Wilson. We've been friends for many years. And although I live in the district, Norma thought that I would get something out of this discussion today. And I want to thank you, Norma, if you're on. I don't see you, for inviting me. I was also invited by Norma to several of your fundraisers during which I enjoyed the Zydeco music, and just any number of times I came to fundraisers.
Did she promise you gumbo too?
no.
No, but she promised gumbo at the birthday celebration.
Okay.
Yes, when you were there. But I'd like to also thank you for your military service.
Thank you.
My husband was also, he passed away in 2015, a graduate of the Howard University School of Law, class of 75. His name was Joseph Irvin. But in listening to you speak, this was just riveting, listening to you recount these experiences. And although they were all iconic and very, they could have amounted to some very serious consequences, especially when you mentioned placing the signs outside the polling station.
Yeah.
Yeah, had you been a young, immature juvenile who might have, if he had been approached by an officer belligerently approaching him, cursing, the young person might have taken off running.
Yeah.
And might have ended up being shot in the back.
Yeah.
Or as you said, just, it's unimaginable how that could have ended tragically. So
Yeah.
I'm so glad that the woman, the female officer, recognized you, and it ended differently, although whether he was from Howard County or Timbuktu, should not have helped you in the manner in which he did. And this is all that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to get across, that all lives matter. I'm not going to prolong my question, but I'd like to know how did you approach these fifth graders when you, and what did you decide to say to them? Was it about race in America? That I'd just like to know how you addressed young kids at that age, in that age group.
Well, first of all, my granddaughter was in the class because it's her class.
Yes.
And so naturally, as a grandparent, you want to impress your grandkids and make sure that you don't do something to say something and embarrass them in front of their friends. But what I wanted to do were things that were just quite simple. Just talk about America today versus America many years ago, because it was the history of African-American history, and to show how people have, in fact, moved forward. To say, this is what my life was many years ago, this is what it's like now. And I had a couple of photographs with me sort of show and tell. And one photograph was the house next door to the house that I grew up in, and they were all the same type houses. The house that I grew up in ultimately was destroyed a few years ago, and I don't have a readily photograph. But I had a photograph of the house next door, 3-room shotgun house. And I had a photograph of my current house. And so I said to them, this is where I came from. This is where I live now. And it's a dramatic difference of those two houses. So forth. And I also had some earlier photographs of the people I've interacted with. And I had a picture of myself with Joe Biden, one with President Obama, because it was more of a, young people show and tell. And I talked about meeting people like Dr. King. So it was trying to be more visual to express to them the sort of before and afters. And it was just riveting in terms of how they viewed all of those things. Because again, to say it to you, you understand what segregation was like. You understand the challenges. And the kids have read this on paper, obviously have textbooks that address these things, but that's on paper. That's different than someone standing before you and says, this is what I experienced. This is what I went through. Here's where I had to sit in the balcony. And they just found it just amazing, because the questions about that, they asked more questions about Dr. King, about separate water fountains, and the sort of things that seem sort of mundane, but for them, it was quite interesting.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
As a follow-up,
Thank you.
I don't want to monopolize, but what do you have to say about the removal of the Confederate activists and the monuments, the removal of the, do you think this gives a miseducation to young people about the fact that it was really an act of treason and terrorism against?
Well, I have two different reactions. One reaction is that there have been some who've asked for just about removal of every kind of monument or statue going. Someone wants to remove the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial. I think that's, in my opinion, way over the top. I had discussion with someone who was talking about removing the people we should blow up Mount Rushmore. I think those kinds of things are simply not acceptable. But for me, there's a difference between what you just described as the Civil War memorials, that is people who fought to basically, separate the country and to uphold slavery. To me, those things should be in a museum, should not be on public land, and we should not have that in a way that purports to glorify that aspect of our history. We can learn from that by putting it in a museum, and we should learn from that by putting it in the textbook. But the taxpayers and others should not be paying to maintain and have them glorified in public spaces. As county executive, we had a similar statue in Rockville, right across the street from my office as county executive. Many of you don't know it because I did it quietly. I had it removed. I removed it early one morning at about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I had the cranes, I let a contract out. We came by and picked it up, and they took it to Poolsville, and we had already arranged with someone who would want to take it on their private property at a place that was appropriate for it, I thought. And by the time the press got wind of it, it was done. And many in Montgomery County, very few people know about it, but it was moved to Poolsville. And so I didn't think we should destroy it. I think people should view it, but I just thought having taxpayers pay to maintain it in a place of public prominence was not acceptable. I didn't go to the county council, ask for their permission. I didn't ask them for the money. I just allocated it and did it. And I said, well, if you got a problem with that, then you're gonna just see me about it. I did it. It was gone. And you didn't even hear about it because it was just done.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Do we have other comments, questions? Martine, I saw you first, followed by Charles.
I have a fun question. I think it might be fun for Mr. Leggett. I had an African-American boss for a good time at one of the Montgomery County consulting firms that did research, and she told me one day, you know, Martine, I've had this strategy for a long time, and it used to be terribly necessary, but I still do it. That when I'm starting a meeting, I usually do like this informal, non-substantive chat for about 5 minutes to just let all the white folks get used to seeing my face up here in charge of things. So I just wondered if you had any similar behind the scenes strategies that you used to use.
You know, you're right. And unfortunately, we do have, on occasion have to do those kinds of things. And I'm certain that I've done an awful lot in my life. And here's one that you probably did not notice. And it was very clear and obvious, but you probably just did not notice. What does most people refer to me as here? Ike. Ike, right? That's what you know me by, is Ike. Despite the fact that there are all these other degrees and other things that are associated with my name, people know me as Ike. Now, I did that somewhat intuitively on the following reason. When I grew up in Louisiana, I recognized that many of the more strident segregationists and people who are very hard on African Americans always, not always, quite often made exceptions to African Americans or blacks that they knew. And they could always tell you, well, I know Jane Doe, they work for me, or this person has worked for a friend of mine, or this person is almost like a friend of my family. You have to keep in mind that in the South, in most part of segregation, you are not physically segregated. You know, people work fairly close together. Oftentimes, African Americans worked in the home, taking care of the babies and all the things that had a very close personal intimacy. But there was always this psychological separation that you had. It wasn't as much of a physical separation because there were so many African Americans in the work field of the South was so close together that you literally could not do that. And so you would see blacks and white working together, but in a hierarchy. So they were not physically separate. And they always made exception. If you would ask a white person in the South, their attitude about race, they would make an exception, say, oh, I know John Doe. We treated them, we did this, we did that. I gave money for him to go to school or whatever it may have been. They could always say that about one or two persons in their life. But as a group, they had a big distinction. So I grew up with a sort of intuitive belief that if white people got to know someone closely, they made exceptions and treated them differently than African Americans as a whole. Not quite the same as they treated their close friends, but they made an exception between them, all right? And so I saw a person who was a strong segregation, treated blacks poorly. There was a kid in my community that fell into sort of like a sinkhole. And this white guy jumped in and pulled him out. What is this? He gets out of the water, he's screaming and yelling and calling blacks all kinds of names, but he just jumped in the water and pulled this black kid out. He happened to know the kid's father who used to work for him. I was at a service station once. My father used to work nearby. We stopped off at a service station. And this young man, a kid about 14 or 15 years old, disrespected this elderly black man who worked for his father there at the service station. And this father cursed his own son out and slapped him for the way he talked to this elderly black man. Don't you ever do this. This man is almost like a part of it. Don't you? It's his own son. And I'm looking at this, how could you have this sort of bipolarization that they are treating blacks this way generally 99% of the time, but yet and still they're making these, quote, exceptions in their mind. It's almost like schizophrenia in some ways. That's what you would find throughout the South. I don't remember, you remember General, I think it was Burnett in Mississippi when they were going through the challenges of the segregation of Mississippi. And James Meredith was ultimately led into school and the governor was trying to stop it and he was trying to preclude that. Well, there was one day they were looking for the governor. They've been looking for him all evening and the following morning. And then finally he came out of the woods early the next morning. You know what he'd been? He'd been in the woods hunting with two black friends in the woods all night virtually. Here it is, the governor who's saying no to James Meredith. He's out in the woods with two black people. They got guns. He had no trepidation of being out in the woods with two black people in the middle of the night, because they were, in his mind, were friends. Yet and still, he was denying this guy entry into the University of Mississippi. And so what came to me intuitively was that, you know, if whites really get to know people, understand them better, maybe they may just treat them a little bit differently. And so my view in terms of running for office was to have people get to know me. It's one thing to say no to someone you don't know, you've never met, but I'm going to force you to say no to my face. So I'm going to come to your meetings. I'm going to participate in your organization. I'm going to be there in front of you as Ike. I'm part of your neighborhood. I'm part of your organization. And you got to tell me no to my face. And they never did. It was always yes. Even though some of them probably treated blacks a different way, they said yes. 7 times. When I first ran, the African American population was 6%. Had I quadrupled that number and had the former mayor of Chicago, Bill Daley, counting the votes for me, there would be no way for me to win without overwhelming white voters. That's who voted for me, because they knew me. They knew me. They knew Ike, and they voted accordingly. And so that's part of this sort of DNA, how we get people who act differently in different places. I didn't know that I was doing that, but in some ways, intuitively, that is what happened. So yes, there are examples to be made. Let me give you one other one, and then I'll stop and go to the next question. When I became county executive, I think it was in November, the new staff that I'd hired said to me, we need to go to Wall Street to introduce you to the bonding people there in Wall Street, because these are the people who decide the county's creditworthiness, this, that, and the other. And so I said, really? We need to go now? He said, yes, we need to go up there and just see them. Now, normally you don't go until you have some bonding issues to go. It is when you're getting ready to float bonds, you go up and make presentations, you do all the kinds of things you need to do in order to get them to look favorably upon the county's financial records. And that generally would not be until the next May or June. So this was November. So I said, okay. So we go up. The first meeting we go to Standard & Poor's. Then after the meeting, one of my staff people said, oh boy, there were a lot of people that showed up at this meeting. Now remember, I just become county executive only a few weeks earlier. The next meeting we go to, I think was Fitch. Same thing happened. A bunch of people showed up at the meeting. Some vice president and analyst you hadn't seen in a long while. And then the last one we were scheduled to go, I think it was to Moody's. And I said, listen, here's what has happened. I said, normally some of these people don't even show up in meetings. And I should not have to come up here. But Montgomery County, one of the wealthiest counties in America, has just elected an African American for the first time. They want to see me. They don't want to see a resume. They don't want to see a photograph. They want to see this African American. Not next May. They want him up here now, right now. Bring him up here now. In their mind, they figure they were thinking, well, wait a minute. He's going to come up here, and he's going to have a dashiki on, and he's going to tell the people here that he's going to take all the county's money and put it in Popeye's chicken and watermelons and stuff. Bring him up here right now. We want to see him now. Now, I knew that the first time that my staff member asked me to go. You know what I did? I said, okay, we'll go. And normally what happens is the following. The county executive, whoever happens to be the person in charge, will go and make a few comments and then turn it over to the staff to run through all the numbers, all the statistics, and our bond, why we need this, the other. And the rest of the presentation goes maybe an hour and a half, right? So I knew that. So I go, and we have 9 people with us. I'm the only African-American there. I'm the new county executive. So I do all the talking. Nobody does any presentation but me. I don't have a piece of paper in front of me. I don't have no notes. no pencil, no computer, no iPad, nothing. I talked for an hour and 15 minutes going from one end of the county's budget, all the prior things that we've done, all the things we're going to do in the future. And you can see these people sitting there saying, oh my God, this guy really has a master of this. Now, why did I do that? I did that to demonstrate to them, A, I knew what they were doing, and B, just who they were dealing with. I didn't have a piece of paper in front of me. And finally, in the same point, the last year of my administration, I normally present the budget to the county council in a breakfast meeting before I present it to the entire budget. The big old document like that. So I call the council together and we have breakfast, and I just sit around the table and talk to them about the budget. And so midway through my discussions with them, at that time, Councilmember George Leventhal sends out a text. And this is what he said in the text. He said, we're sitting here, the county executive has been talking for a half an hour or so. He does not have a piece of paper in front of him. And he has been discussing the budget from A to Z. He said, I just find it fascinating. That's one of the council members said that. He said that. I got the text of it. The challenge is, and what he didn't realize, I'd done that for 12 years. I never had a piece of paper in front of me. If you ever went to a budget forum and ever discussion before me, you didn't see a piece of paper, a note in front of me. I had the capacity to stand there and talk to them about the budget virtually from A to Z without a piece of paper in my hand. But I had to go to Wall Street to demonstrate for them to see me so they would know what kind of person they're dealing with.
I believe we also had a question from Charles. Can I?
Yeah, Ike, I'd like to tell you how much I've enjoyed your talk. I'm in New Hampshire here.
Oh, okay.
Again, I got invited by my cousin who owes you the gumbo.
Oh,
I was
God.
going to tell you that she is like the Lord who multiplied the loaves.
Yep.
Got more work out of that one pot of gumbo than anybody.
I think you the one to get the garlic, right?
No, yeah, well, she's got another friend. But
All
I
right.
wanted to tell you, I live in New Hampshire, and I attended a seminar at Dartmouth College, and they were talking about removal of the Confederate symbols. And I got up and spoke how I am actually in favor of the Confederate flag.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody questioned, why are you in favor of the Confederate flag? I said, if I'm parking my truck in a parking lot and the guy has a Confederate flag in the back of his window, I won't park next to him. If he's got a Donald Trump bumper sticker on this truck with the Confederate flag, I might even get to a different parking lot. So I want to let you know how much I enjoyed your talk. And
Thank you.
Norma didn't, I know she doesn't brag too much. But Martin Luther King went to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to learn how to do bus boycotts from her uncle's church.
Yeah, I know.
He did a lot of good work, but he had a lot of support behind him. But
Certainly.
yeah, I want to thank you again. This was a great talk. The only problem is it should have been filmed so that we can see it again, because I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very
Hopefully
much.
Doug will share the video with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that question, comment. And yes, the video we are taping, and the video will be posted to Silver Spring Village's YouTube account, hopefully a little bit later this afternoon. Other questions or comments? Ann Gavin, and I believe I saw Dr. Blakely.
Hi, I'm going to call you Ike since I feel like I know you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think as amazing as the incredible personal challenges you overcame, what I find amazing about your talk is your incredible optimism about how our country can continue to make some progress. I think we all need reminders of that kind of hope and aspiration as we're going through these times. The question I have for you is, as a county executive and in many of your other roles, you have been intimately and competently involved with levers of power and levers of change. And I was wondering what insights you might give us about what some of the impediments are to overcoming some of the systemic racism that still exists, and what we might do to try to get over those impediments.
Well, there are two, and I think, and thank you for your question, by the way. There are two, and I think they are somewhat interrelated. One of which, there seemed to be some resistance from those who believe that something is being taken away from them, that their way of life, their livelihood, the tradition, the culture, that may be jeopardized or taken away. Some people describe it as privilege, but it may be broader than just say privilege per se. But when someone feels that something inherently will be taken away from you, that you cherish, that you believe in, that you accept, that you work for, you're going to get a resistance from it. Whether or not that resistance is correct or wrong, you're going to get it. And as a result of that, what we have to do is to try to demonstrate and understand the plight of people in that situation. You can't ignore it, because you do so at your peril. You can't ignore the fact that a person who said, well, you know, my father grew up in this community. He worked at the steel mill. He worked at the automobile factory. I worked all of my life, and we were able to come out of that, send our kid to college, buy a car, and we live a good, typical, normal life. I've never had anything beyond that. And so now I feel that that is jeopardized. You can't ignore that. How you deal with that may vary from community to community, but you simply cannot ignore a person who, in their minds, is fixated with that. And so we have to, demonstrate that what we are doing is more inclusive and not in a way that is designed to destroy what we have, but to make it better. And so when you get the points where you say, and that's why I use the statues as an example, you say that you're going to destroy the Washington Monument or the Jefferson Memorial or take down Mount Rushmore, you're running head on into that. And so you could separate that from the Civil War memorials, because that doesn't go to our heritage and traditions the way those other things do. Yes, some of those people owned slaves, and yes, some of them did some things wrong, but you have to look at the totality of life, and you have to look at how some people will affix themselves to those kinds of symbols. Because what I said earlier was that it's about culture, it's about the history, it's about life that they've had to enjoy, and it's about all of those things, and people feel that something is taken away. You have to make people feel that's all right. And I don't want to take anything from you. I want to be much more inclusive and build on all of that. I don't want to see America destroyed. I wanted to see it better, because what we have worked for is to be inclusive in all the things that are here. You got, in my opinion, the best nation in the world. And so why end up with something that's less than that, to say that we are equal, but at a much lower level of existence? I wanted to remain a high place of educational, culture, interest, but I want to make sure that at that level, everyone is included. That's the biggest step for us, is to convince people on the other side. And then on the other side, we have to make sure the people who are resistant understand, and this is why the thing with Pete Carroll is so important, that whites have a place to play in here. They have a place in this struggle, because Ike Leggett and all the Ike Leggetts in the world cannot solve this problem alone. It requires all of us working together. And all the things that have happened most recently in terms of the racial divide, one that is probably more disturbing to me was the one out of New York. You know, we had the shooting in Minnesota, I mean, in Louisville, we had the shooting in Georgia, we had the situation in Minnesota, and many others around the nation where people have died. All of them are horrific and loss of life. But the one that reminds me of so much of the problem of getting that last 15 yards or so is the one in New York. And here's why. It was much more systemic. A person calls the police. In her mind, if I describe the problem this way, an African American who is disrespected me about the dog or what have you, and I tell this to the police, in my mind, as a female calling to say that, I believe that I could get a quick response. I believe that the police, on the other hand, will respond much more aggressively to that. And I believe that the person I'm talking about, the African American, will shiver in their boots the fact that I'm doing that. That is systemic. That is pervasive. It didn't require a loss. It didn't end up being a loss of life. But that says more about our community and our country than these others do. You know, this happened in New York, Central Park. This wasn't in some isolated place in the South or somewhere. This happened in New York. So that to me suggests a much more difficult problem of running those last 15 yards than the shootings do. And so that's the way I see that. But those are the two things that we both have to do, in my opinion. Thank you.
Dr. Blakely, I believe you're next, and then Cheryl.
Am I unmuted?
No, it's good.
Okay. I'd really just like to say thank you for joining for this session. My wife Cheryl and I have lived in Silver Spring for almost 50 years now. Have followed your career very closely, and yours and my life experiences have very closely paralleled, and hopefully sometime we might get together to discuss all that.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to thank you for your service, your long service here in the county. And to Norma, I thought I was the only one
Oh,
that
no.
you a gumbo IOU.
Oh, no.
And now I'm wondering if there's going to be some favoritism because I'm from Alabama and you found this other guy who's from Louisiana.
Oh, no. Doug, can you mute people?
No, because I'm expecting gumbo too. So we're going to have to chip in and buy you the biggest pot for fun. Cheryl, if you can cook gumbo, you can ask your question.
Yeah.
Me? Oh, well, I can't cook any gumbo, but I'm still going to ask a question. Thank you so much for coming, and I really enjoyed your remarks. And I wanted to ask you specifically about dealing with the police department in Montgomery County. And I've been living in Montgomery County for the last 45 years, so I too have followed your career and followed things in the news, and I know there have been some difficulties, and I'm just wondering what you learned in that process of dealing with a police department that could potentially help other places as they struggle with how to make them, bring them to a point where they're less aggressive with African Americans, or they're, they just improve their relationships with the community.
Thank you for your question, by the way. Yeah, there are some challenges in the police department, but I think overall you have a pretty good police force. You do have some challenges therein. And in a community of our size, where you have people who act outside of the rules and regulations and too aggressively, that has a tremendous impact and tarnishes the entire community. So there are problems, I would admit that. But there are a couple of things that I think we have started to do and need to continue to do. one of which is better training for the police overall. One of the things that I built in Montgomery County was a complete new police training headquarters. And we have staffed that with a lot of the upgrades and things and simulations that can help police to make better decisions. We've introduced information in about how they respond in a more broad community. And more importantly, that we've done a better job of outreach and hiring a broader array of police who more or less look like the community and respond to the community. And the other factor that I think is important is to have police live in the community. That's a huge, huge plus, in my opinion, to have the police look like the community and actually live in the community. Right now, there are large numbers of police that don't live in Montgomery County. And those that do live in Montgomery County live in only a certain section of Montgomery County. Many of the charges and problems that you've seen with related to our police have happened sort of inside the Beltway areas, close to the Beltway area. If you take a look at the number of police, A, that live in Montgomery County, and B, that live in that section of Montgomery County, it's a very, very few police. So they need to live in the community. And then from the legislative side, you need to change some of the regulations that exist. One of which, I actually went to court and had a referendum fight against my own police department because of something called effects bargaining. That any kind of changes that you wanted to make in terms of personnel and training, all the things that we were talking about, they had to be fully negotiated as though you're going to negotiate a contract, effects bargaining. Because the police could argue that they affected bargaining, therefore you had to bargain all those things. It was a pretty broad concept. Well, I got rid of that. The police fought me about it. And ultimately, we ended up going to a referendum, and I won on that and won in court as well. You need to change the police a Bill of Rights in Maryland. That's something throughout the entire state that gives the police a huge due process upper hand in terms of any complaints that you have. And thirdly, you need to be consistent and forcefully in terms of enforcement about things. And you need to be able to do it quickly, because if you have a problem, and the way the process goes now, it may take you 2 or 3 years to discipline someone who is out on suspension, who's still getting a paycheck, and you've forgotten about the causal relationship between what they did and the punishment that may come some years afterwards. I think if anything comes out of the struggles that we see now, a lot of those changes around the country are going to be made. And I think we're going to have a great deal of success on that. So those are the things I think we need to do. Thank you.
We have about 6 minutes left. I see Jane has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I live in East Silver Spring Civic Association, and Ike, when you were running in the primary for county executive, we had the town hall there. And so, we did not see it. We did not see the candidates in a racial situation. We saw them as issues. So I'm wondering, in retrospect, if you can think back that far, how did you see it? I think it was a very successful town hall, and of course we were rooting for you, and it was televised, but I did not see a racial component to it. And then my other quick question later on is, I know you're involved in interfaith organizations and such, and I wonder if you could talk about how that helps the cause.
Well, thank you for your comment. Thank you for your support. And I'm glad that there are many people who saw it as you did. And what I described in terms of the race factor were things that I saw initially early on when I had to take the photograph off the brochure at that point in time. Later on, I came to realize that the people were not seeing that way in Montgomery County. So I agree with you on that statement. The interfaith is an extremely significant part of that. I enhanced our interfaith work. Casey Mansfield has done a terrific job of bringing so many of the religious leaders together, because many of the problems that we discussed about race and community and culture really cross-sect a large number of people, and it's best to have people in the community addressing those rather than elected public officials. You're much more likely to do something if a person in your church, in your community, asking you to do it, and agreeing to be a part of a dialogue rather than a public official telling you something that's part of their responsibility. So I believe heavily, heavily in that aspect of support. Thank you. If it, I want to make, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I think we have one more question from Adi.
Yeah. I want to make a
I
closing
just
comment.
want
That's
to
what
just say thank you so much, Ike. I thoroughly enjoyed your message today as much as I did Dr. Begley's previously. As a follow through to your response to Cheryl, I wanted to just find out if are there any programs we have in Montgomery County that sort of bring the police community closer to the Black community or even other minority communities so that they can be, get to know each other better? I think that would help both sides.
I think under the Office of Human Rights, there are a couple that they have, and I think an organization, NAACP, have a public safety work group, and the police department has that as well. And if, depending on which district that you're in, I know that you can get involved with those as well. So it's a matter of just reaching out, and oftentimes they really want to hear from community leaders, and they don't hear from them until there's a problem or a difficulty. So my view would be to probably check with them and go from there. Thank you for your question. Let me make a final comment before we get off. And I've talked an awful lot about gumbo, and in a metaphor, in a way, the gumbo, the dish, reflects my hopeful belief about our community, about our diversity and the challenges. Many people initially think of a gumbo as a soup that you throw everything in and it sort of integrates itself in sort of a blend that comes out. And at the end of it, you don't recognize it. That's the sort of force integrated component of what I think does not work properly. But in the gumbo, the people who know the gumbo, you realize the gumbo is made of separate parts. You have your meats, you may have your vegetables, you may have your fish. When you put them in the pot, the idea is not that you stir them up or they become so blended that you don't recognize them at the end of the dish. At the end of the dish, you still recognize the distinctions of those components therein. You see the meat, you see the poultry, you see the seafood, you see the vegetables that are there. You see all of those components, but they are all part of one big pot, and they are held together by something that's called the roux. The roux is the liquid in the gumbo that holds all of these distinct pieces together. And in so doing, I see Montgomery County as our nation as a big gumbo, something that does not destroy our individuality, does not destroy the separate cultures, does not destroy the separate religions. We're all in this big pot together. We all have our distinction, but we are held together by this roux. That roux to me is our love for humanity, our love for one another. And so what I would like to leave you with today is to make Montgomery County and make this nation one big happy gumbo, all coming together, maintain our distinction, but held together in love by this roux that is distinct and brings people together in love. That's what I see in a hopeful view for America. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow.
To that, I would like to add that justice is love made public.
Thank you.
Doug, I'm sorry, can I just say something about this gumbo?
Sure, Norma.
Just close, because I have all of you as witnesses. He just gave you the recipe for making gumbo. that he can make his own gumbo.
No.
That's not going to get you off the hook, Norma. We'll schedule out a time.
Thanks, Doug.
I don't think I've ever been here at the end of a village Zoom than I am this one. Again, thank you, Ike. It was a terrific presentation. We really appreciate it. To everyone else, keep in mind this is one in a series of presentations we're doing on issues of race, ethnicity, social justice. Our planning committee will actually be meeting on Monday to think through our next few months of presentations. So if you have ideas, please feel free to email Marta Brendan or email me or Connie on that group too. So again, thanks everyone. We really appreciate it and have a great afternoon.